Hello and welcome to this Farming Connect webinar. My name is Sarah Peterson and I'm a farm animal vet specialising in cattle lameness and based in Cowbridge, South Wales. Over the next 40 minutes or so, I want to provide you with some information regarding the project that is currently underway at Graig Olway farm in Usk, South Wales. This is one of the Farming Connect demonstration sites and it's a 3-year project that we're undertaking focused on reducing lameness in the robotically milked dairy herd. I'll be starting the webinar by giving you an overview of the farm enterprise at Graig Olway and why it is felt it's so important to focus on feet. Then I'll introduce the project plan, which is essentially to implement the AHDB Healthy Feet programme over a 3-year period, before providing an update as to where we've currently reached in the project and how we aim to move forward in the future. So starting with the farm overview. Graig Olway is located in Usk, South Wales and is very much a mixed farm. It's a 240 hectare holding operating as dairy, beef, sheep and arable enterprises. It's a family business run by Russell Morgan and his mother and aunt Glenys and Jane Morgan, and the farm has been producing milk ever since Russell's grandparents bought the holding in 1946. The project itself is focused on the dairy herd, which currently comprises of 185 high-yielding Holstein dairy cows, which are milked through 3 Lely robots. The robots were installed in 2013 and the herd has adapted well, currently averaging 3.2 visits per day. The herd's producing 1,000 litres per year per cow at 3.95% butterfat and 3.25% protein, with milk sold to Muller on a standard contract. Cows are housed all year round in cubicles with mattress and sawdust bedding, and they're fed a grass and maize silage based TMR with additional concentrate fed through the robots. The herd rears most of its own replacements, with heifers calving in at an average of 24 months of age. The main herd calves all year round with a current calving interval of 405 days. And here's an aerial photograph that just shows the layout of the farm. So we have the main farm drive coming in from the right hand side of the photograph, and the main adult dairy herd is housed in the main shed at the top of the drive on the left. So on one side of the shed we have one main group of cows, all second lactation onwards, have around a maximum of 120 cows in this group, which have free access to 2 robots. Next to this we have a separate heifer group, a maximum of 60 animals in this group because they've only got access to the 1 robot. However, we do have a straw yard facility behind this, which also have access to that same robot that the heifers used. However, they are kept completely separate, and that's for special needs cows, so any cows that may be severely lame or struggling after calving. Next to this straw yard, we've got another separate straw yard, which is for the close to dry cows. Across the yard and next to a workshop, we have the calves, which are housed next to the old dairy site. And then just up the yard, we have cubicle housing for the far off dry cows. Young stock are housed under one roof with the beef unit as well, and that's a mixture of cubicles and straw yards under that roof. So moving on to the project. So the project is focused on feet and reducing lameness in a robotic milking herd. Let's start by considering why lameness matters. Well, at any given time across the UK, on average, 1 in 3 of our dairy cows are lame. And this obviously has wide-ranging impact on the industry. First and foremost, it's perhaps the biggest welfare concern currently for dairy cows. And this obviously is a potential threat to consumer perception of the dairy industry. Finally, it also has a very severe economic impact. On average, studies have shown that lameness will cost around £2.20 for every day that the cow is lame, and lameness tends to be, on average, 6 to 8 weeks condition if the cow is caught early and treated early. So, for instance, if we took a 100 cow herd with an average lameness level of 33%, this is going to result in daily losses of £72.60 or £26,500 per year. So although a lot of the costs associated with lameness are hidden, so we don't tend to see the costs associated with increased cull rate, reduced fertility and reduced yield, they do add up. And this does mean that it is, again, one of the most economically draining diseases within our industry. So why have we decided to focus on feet at Graig Olway? Well, two of Russell's farm goals were to reduce lameness and improve cow comfort, and these really go hand in hand. The SWOT analysis that was undertaken right at the very start of the project indicated that lameness was a weakness on the farm, and in fact it was the biggest challenge to herd health. So it was decided that a 3-year-long project on lameness would be most beneficial to the farm. Where do we start when it comes to tackling lameness? So first of all, we need to know how much we've got. So what's the prevalence of lameness on the farm? How do we compare to the UK average? And how do we compare to the target of less than 10%? Then we need to identify what the main lesion or lesions causing lameness on the farm are, because this is going to help us identify the risk factors that are specifically associated with this lesion. There are lots and lots of risk factors associated with lameness, however, not all of them result in the same lesion. So therefore, a tailored approach is really vital if we want to see the maximum return on our time and effort in implementing changes. And then finally, we need to actually do something about these. So where we've identified risk factors, we need to put an action plan in place to deal with them. We're lucky when it comes to lameness that we have a structured approach in the AHDB Healthy Feet programme. And this really sets about answering the questions that I raised in the last slide through a 4-point plan. The first step is to look at a record analysis and mobility score, so to determine how much lameness we have and also what's causing it. Next comes a risk and skills assessment to determine what the main risk factors on the farm are and whether any of the team needs to be upskilled in terms of detection and treatment of lameness. Next comes the action plan. So we know what we've got to do, but when are we going to do it and how are we going to do it? And then crucially, step 4 is the review, because we need to review the actions that have been put in place, determine whether they've improved lameness, and if they haven't, look into why not. So we'll move on now to look at actually how the AHDB Healthy Feet programme was implemented at Graig Olway. We started with step 1, the mobility score and record analysis. On the 9th of January this year, we conducted the first mobility score for the project. So we scored the entire herd, so both milking and dry cows, and we used the AHDB mobility score, which scores cows from a 0, which is not lame, up to a 3, which is severely lame. So to run through these quickly, a score 0 is perfect mobility, so an animal striding out very confidently with equal weight bearing and rhythm. A score 1 is not a lame cow, but she's not quite qualifying for a perfect mobility score. A score 2 is a lame cow, where we can easily identify a leg or legs that she's lame on. And a score 3 is a very lame cow, so this would be a cow that wouldn't be able to keep up with the rest of the herd. So we can classify score 0 and 1 as not lame animals, whereas score 2 and 3 would classify as lame. This graph here shows the results of the mobility score. So green represents sound or not lame cows, so scores 0 and 1. Red is score 2 cows or lame cows, and the grey area represents very lame or the score 3 cows. So overall, across the whole herd, we have 39% of the herd scoring as lame. This is broken down into 34% score 2 or lame cows and 5% score 3 or very lame cows. A level of 39% is obviously higher than the UK average, but not unexpected in a herd where lameness is the main herd health concern. If this is then broken down by groups, you can see how it varies. So obviously on the straw yard, where we had only a few cows, the majority of these were our very lame cows, because they were in there as needing special attention. In the cows and the heifer groups, we were both just around between 36 to 39%. One concern was the level of lameness in the dry cows, because the cows were receiving a dry off trim, so really we didn't want to be expecting any lameness in that group, and also similarly in the transition group. So that is one area that we want to be focusing on in the future. So this graph here takes those scores and breaks them down by lactation. So we've got lactation from 1 to 5 and above along the bottom axis. Again, the numbers represent green as not lame, red as lame, and grey as very lame. The numbers on the bar chart actually represent the number of cows in each of those categories. So you can see, as expected, that lameness increases with increasing lactation. So we would expect our heifers to be the soundest of the herd and our older cows to have more lameness. And this is the pattern that we see here. However, one key aim for the future is to reduce the levels of lameness in the heifer group. So currently around 25% of heifers are lame, but we really want to be reducing this to less than 5% in the future. One of the main risks for a cow going lame is a previous episode of lameness. So if we start off by reducing lameness in the heifers, year on year, we'll see a huge reduction across the herd. So the next step was to identify what was causing lameness. Now, once we'd finished the mobility score, we did a digital dermatitis score at the feed barrier. Digital dermatitis is very easy to identify in the parlour by washing off the feet and looking at the backs of the heels. However, it does represent more of a challenge in a robotic herd. So one of the things we wanted to do within this project was actually determine whether identifying cows at the feed barrier would be enough for digital dermatitis control. So we scored them at the feed barrier. You can see there using a torch. And this is the sort of thing that we were seeing. So all of these feet have digital dermatitis. The two photographs on the left have active lesions, so red raw lesions that are painful for the cow. The cow on the right, well, she's definitely got DD. You can see there that we've got excessive skin growth in the backs between the heels, the backs of the foot between the heels there. However, it was difficult to determine whether these were active lesions or just previous lesions that were now dormant. So across all of the cows that we scored at the feed barrier, we identified 50 cows with lesions, or 27% of the herd having 1 or 2 lesions. So we wanted to determine whether this was accurate. So the gold standard is obviously to put cows through the crush. So that's what we did over the next couple of days. So we ran the cows through the crush on the 13th of January, so 4 days after we'd identified them at the feed barrier. Again, much easier to identify lesions and actually to stage them, so determine whether they're active or inactive. And in the crush, we identified 72 cows with lesions, so 39% of the herd, which just showed that we missed around 22 cows that were infected, but we hadn't been able to identify them as affected at the feed barrier. So going forward, it's probably a good way of identifying new cows, but we have to accept that we will probably miss some of the new cases, particularly in the early stages. So let's have a look at those DD scores in a little bit more detail. At the very start of the project, Russell said to me that he felt DD was a main issue within the herd. Now, 39% of the herd had a DD lesion on one or both of the hind feet. And this, when we see an endemically affected herd, we do tend to find that around 40% of cows are affected. Now, it doesn't mean that they all are lame with DD. In fact, we find that only about 50% of cows that have active DD red sore lesions are actually lame with them. But it does mean that they've got DD sat deep within the foot, creating a reservoir of infection within the herd. So 39% of cows had lesions, but they weren't all active. And we did actually stage them as they came through the crush. And this is the breakdown of lesions. So on the left-hand side in red, we found 18 of those lesions were actually active. So those are typically the red raw lesions that are very sore on the backs of the foot. A couple of cows had healing lesions. So these were lesions that were starting to heal. They had the black scabs forming over them. but the vast majority of lesions were what we call dormant lesions. So these are cows that have evidence of previously having had an active DD lesion. However, currently they're in an inactive state, so they're not sore. However, there is changes within the skin that indicate that probably the DD infection is still within the foot, although it's not causing a problem. However, it's sat there waiting for an opportunity to recur. And you can see that there were a few recurring cases within the herd when we did our examination. However, the fact that the large proportion of cows are in the dormant phase does indicate that currently the foot bathing regime that's in place is actually just holding infections at bay. However, we did have more cows in the active phase than I would like. And so what we implemented at this stage was actually a 3-day treatment program from all of those cows that had active lesions. And the aim of that was to actually dampen down the infections within the herd and to stop them spreading it to other cows through the environment. So moving on to the record analysis, because it was perceived that DD was a big problem within the herd, but we just wanted to check that there wasn't anything else lurking in the background that was a bigger concern. So we had a full year's worth of foot trimming records that we could go back and analyse. So this shows the data from all of 2019, and it just shows all the different lesions that were found within the herd. So we've got the numbers on the left-hand side represent the number of lesions recorded. So not the number of cows, but the number of times lesions were recorded. Along the bottom, we've got bruising, sole ulcer, white line, digital dermatitis or DD, toe lesions, sole fractures and foul. The dark blue proportion of the graph shows cows that were, or lesions that were identified for the first time. However, if that cow presented again within the 12 months and she was treated for the same lesion on the same foot, that's what a repeat treatment represents. Because sometimes you could have one cow that comes in 10 times to see a sole ulcer, but it's not necessarily 10 sole ulcers, it's just one sole ulcer that's been treated on 10 occasions. So I just wanted to make the distinction so that we weren't biased by cows having repeated treatments. So you can see here, by and large, the main lesions that we were seeing were sole ulcers and DD. So DD was expected. However, the number of sole ulcers had been underestimated previously, and it wasn't felt that it was as big a concern as we were seeing in the records. So that just indicates why it's important to look at the records, because sometimes you can be diverted away from one of the main causes of lameness on the farm. Breaking these lesions down by lactation, so again looking at what the main causes of lameness in our heifers are versus our older cows. And this shows the split of lesions that were found and the number of animals in each lactation that were found with these lesions. So the orange section relates to sole bruising, red for sole ulcer, yellow for white line, blue is for DD, green for sole fractures and purple for toe lesions. And you can see that as cows get older, we see more sole bruising and sole ulcer. And again, that's what is to be expected. If an animal gets a sole ulcer in her first lactation, she's more likely to get it in her second, her third or fourth, etc. every year of her life. So it really is crucial that we minimise the number of problems in the first lactation. And you can see we had around 12 animals that were diagnosed with lesions in their first lactation. And again, we need to really minimise that going forward. And that's going to be one of our key indicators of success over the next 3 years. When we looked at how many times a cow had been trimmed that year, this again was quite eye-opening, because there were some cows that were being seen an awful lot of times. So the majority of cows were being seen once or twice in the crush. However, there were a proportion of cows that were being seen 3 or more times. Now, under the preventative trimming programme that was in place on the farm at the start of the project, cows were being seen at dry off for a routine preventative trim, and sometimes for a mid-lactation trim around 70 to 80 days as well. However, because we had a lot of cows needing repeat treatments for lameness, it meant that some of these routine trims weren't actually being undertaken. And you can only trim so many cows within a year. So again, it's really important that over the course of the project we reduce the number of times that we're seeing cows repeatedly by making sure that we're implementing more routine preventative trimming, and we're also treating our cows more successfully so that we don't then see them as repeat cases going forward. So in terms of answering the question of how much lameness is there and what's causing it, well, currently 39% of the herd was lame, UK average being 33%, and the main lesions involved were sole ulcer and digital dermatitis. Some cows were being seen too many times, and we need to identify going forward why cows are being seen sometimes up to 6 times a year. And the main reasons this might be happening is that cases might not be identified early enough. The later we identify a lame cow, the more likely she is to develop long-term changes within the foot and then need retreatments. But also we need to look at monitoring successive treatments. So once we'd sort of created the benchmark, we identified how much lameness we had and where it was coming from. The next step of the Healthy Feet programme was to go forward and do a risk assessment on the farm. The risk assessment is divided up into 4 distinct areas, or so-called success factors. If we get all 4 of them right, then we're going to really minimise the risk of lameness in the herd. However, each of the success factors isn't actually linked with each lesion. So for instance, if we start with the first success factor, well, this is low infection pressure. So this is not really related to risk of sole ulcer or white line, but it's more specific to the infectious causes of lameness, so digital dermatitis and also fowl. And this is really focused on lowering the risk of the cow encountering DD or fowl in the environment. So things such as looking at hygiene, frequency of scraping, also looking at foot bath and how that is undertaken and whether it's effective. The next success factor that we look at is good hoof shape and horn quality. So this is really an indication of how well the foot is able to adapt and cope with the environment. So for instance, are we maintaining foot shape through good hoof trimming protocols? Or is the fat pad being maintained through the transition from dry cow through into calving when the cow is at risk of losing body condition score and that pedal bone is at risk of dropping and causing ulceration and bruising within the foot? The third success factor encompasses reducing forces on the feet. Now this looks at both good cow comfort and also good cow flow. Now when it comes to cow comfort, this is whether the cow is lying down for 12 to 14 hours a day like our target is. If they're not, then why not? And this increases the risk of sole ulcers. So for instance, at Graig Olway, where we have an issue with sole ulcers, we'll be focusing very much on this success factor and lowering forces on the feet through improving cow comfort. The other part of low forces on the feet is good cow flow. And this is really specifically related to white line disease. We don't have a huge amount of that when it comes to looking at the lesions that are present at Graig Olway. So this will be less of a consideration in the risk factor on the farm. The final success factor is early detection and prompt effective treatment. And this really relates to all of the lesions that we see within a herd causing lameness. So this is ensuring that we're identifying cows early enough, and once we've identified them as lame, that we're treating them effectively. So when it comes to Graig Olway, really the key areas that we wanted to be focusing on were low infection pressure to reduce the incidence of digital dermatitis. We also wanted to be looking at good cow comfort. So how could we improve cow comfort to reduce the number of sole ulcers that we were seeing on the farm? And also early detection and prompt effective treatment. Really, really important, identifying cows early and then ensuring that we're treating them effectively. This video here just gives you an overview of how the cowshed, the cubicles, is set up. And you can see here that we've got nice wide passageways, clean passageways. They're scraped every hour during the day and every 1.5 hours at night. So there was very minimal pooling of slurry. The cubicles themselves, the dimensions were almost spot on in terms of our target. You can see the majority of cows are lying down. They're not coming into contact with the cubicles when they're getting up and lying down because they're very open fronted. A nice comfortable brisket locator. The main problem with the cubicles and the main reason why we weren't getting the lying times that we would like, and perhaps this was increasing the risk of sole ulcers, was that the lying surface itself, the mattress, was not very comfortable. The top sheet was relatively rough, and even though we were bedding down with soft sawdust twice a day, it was creating quite a rough surface for the cows to lie down on. And also the mattresses, even though they were 6 years old, were quite hard and firm. So that was one of the key areas that we needed to focus on later when it came to action planning. This video here just shows the bottom end of the cow shed. Again, you can see the majority of cows are lying down. You can see that we've got fans installed. They've been installed now for around 8 years. Ideally, they should be installed over the beds because that's where we want to be cooling cows, and that was something that we picked up on the risk assessment. Another thing picked up on the risk assessment was actually ventilation and the boarding. Because we have a multi-span shed, the ventilation, the cross ventilation wasn't as good as it should be. So that's something again that will be raised later on in the action plan. This here just shows the inside of the heifer shed. So again, wide passageways, comfortable cubicles. The mattresses are a different type in the heifer shed, and we don't tend to see as many problems in this group. We have more cows lying down at any time. One thing you'll see there is the cows are very relaxed, and that's a very, very good sign in terms of good stockmanship, and always very, very good to note when you're walking around a herd as part of a risk assessment. So that just gives you an idea about the conditions inside of the shed and the setup of the cubicles, etc. One of the other key things that we focused on as part of the risk assessment was foot bathing, because that's obviously crucial when it comes to digital dermatitis control. Now, foot bathing within a robot herd is more difficult because obviously the cows are going in and out of the robot rather than being milked twice a day, and so it makes foot bathing just a little bit more of a challenge. However, you can see here that we've got a really nice long foot bath, over 4 meters long, situated on the crossover passageway, and the cows were foot bathed every day, so Monday to Friday each week, by locking them back into the cubicle passageway, then feeding them, and then the cows would just filter through on their own. And you can see within the video that these cows are actually getting 3 dunks of each hind foot, which is absolutely spot on target. However, the risk assessment did indicate that there were a couple of changes that we needed to make to the foot bathing regime to just ensure that it is as effective as it could be. So that gives you just a little bit of an indication of what the farm is actually like in terms of its setup. So just bringing all of that together, what were the main risk factors that we found on the farm? Well, certainly cow comfort was a main risk factor, and that's reflected in the number of sole ulcers that we're seeing in the lesion records. Foot bathing, although it was already being done, it was felt that it could actually be done a little bit more effectively. And then also in terms of the foot trimming and the lame cow treatment. Now, as I alluded to earlier, cows were already getting routine preventatively trimmed at dry off. However, they were sometimes missing that extra trim early on in lactation. And whilst cows were being treated when they were being seen as lame, the risk and skills assessment highlighted that maybe we weren't identifying them soon enough. And the final one was ventilation, which again I just touched on in the last few slides. So the reason why ventilation is important when it comes to lameness is obviously during hot spells, and these cows are housed all year round, then it can induce heat stress. When cows are hot, they stand up for longer, and that obviously puts more pressure through the feet. So we were seeing an increase in lameness after a hot spell of weather. So then the important thing, once we had identified all of the risk factors on farm, was actually to pull this all together and come up with a structured plan, an action plan as to when and how we were going to change these risk factors. So on the 29th of January, we brought together all of the team and we discussed what was going well in terms of lameness control. And also what was not going so well. And from this not going so well list, then we decided what action should be taken, how they should be taken, and when. To create the action plan, we brought together the whole farm team on the 29th of January, including the vet and the foot trimmer, who are key components of helping to reduce lameness going forward. And so we started off with focusing what was going well within the herd. Well, we've got a great team at Graig Olway. They are really committed to reducing lameness. They've recognised that there's an increase in lameness. They are really ready to act. And this is really, really pivotal in making sure that actually going forward that this programme is successful. In terms of lameness prevention, we're already doing a preventative trim at dry off, and this is being done by a qualified registered foot trimmer. It's really important if we're undertaking foot trimming that this is done by somebody who is trained. Lame cows were being treated as soon as they were seen by farm staff, and generally the trim setup was very good, so someone could bring out a cow quite quickly from the robot shed, bring them up to the foot trimming crush and get them back relatively easy. Again, this reduces the barriers to treating lame cows as soon as they are seen. The cows in the herd are very quiet, and this is a reflection of good stockmanship, and one of the reasons why I suspect we're seeing relatively low levels of white line disease within the herd. Back at the start of January, when we did our DD score through the crush, we also implemented a blitz treatment of all of those cows that had identified as having active DD lesions. And what this created was a much reduced pool of infection within the herd. So that's also been a very good point in terms of reducing infection pressure and levels of DD. The foot bathing regime was already very good, the foot bath design very good. However, we just needed to do some tweaking. So when we came on to what was not going so well, well, obviously we had a high number of sole ulcers as indicated by the lesion records, and this was pinpointed to heat stress through poor ventilation during the hot summer months and also poor cow comfort as a result of the old mattresses. Early identification of lameness was a concern, so whilst as soon as cows were seen as being lame they were treated, we weren't actually identifying them soon enough. Whilst preventative trimming was being done at dry off, some of the cows were missing their mid-lactation trims, and this was then increasing their risk of going lame later on in lactation. So the focus needed to be more on prevention and earlier treatment when they did go lame. The concrete around the robots was relatively rough, so this was decided that this would be a risk factor for white line, although not a priority. It was a concern because this is an area of high traffic. Formalin was being used for the foot bath, however, because of the concerns regarding formalin now being a known carcinogen, we wanted to look at safe handling practices and making sure that we have the relevant PPE and health and safety measures in place for its use. The foot bath was also not being replenished enough, so the same foot bathing solution would be used for a number of consecutive days in a row, and this actually increases the risk by the time the last cow goes through it a couple of days later that actually they're going through an inactive foot bath and it could be spreading DD. So we wanted to make sure that where the effort and time was and the cost was going towards foot bathing, that this would be effective. Whilst the regime for the milking herd was very good, it wasn't in place. There was no regime in place for the dry cows. And this meant that any dry cows that picked up DD or had recurring infections during the dry period could actually then come into the herd and spread it to other cows. There was also crossover between the sucklers and the dry cows through sharing of a yard up near the dry cow cubicle housing. And again, this was a concern in terms of risk of spread, particularly of DD, from one group to the other. And finally, a minor point, but the feed barrier in the heifers, there was one section that was too low, so heifers were having to push at the feed barrier to feed in that section. And again, this puts additional forces through the feet, particularly the front feet. So we used the what was going well and what was not going so well to come up with an action plan for the next sort of 6 months. And so what we determined as a group was which action needed to be done, when it needed to be done. And this was really so that at each review, every 6-month review, we can go back and look at what progress has been made and perhaps where some of the changes haven't been implemented, why they haven't been implemented, and what some of those barriers were to implementation and how we can help remove them. So looking at this in a little bit more detail, let's look at the very short-term actions. So whilst we were trimming, doing preventative trims in the cows, we looked at doing in-calf heifers, and one of our immediate actions was to start trimming in-calf heifers at 8 weeks before calving. This was because we were seeing some bruising and also some sole ulcers in heifers when they were early on into lactation. So it was felt by just making sure that the feet were modelled out and shaped correctly, before they calve for the first time, we could mitigate some of that risk. Second on our action plan was to ensure all cows eligible trimming were presented at each trim visit. So as I said earlier, some of the cows were being missed off from the routine preventative trimming. So we wanted to make sure going forward that all of the relevant cows were seen. And this is where we'll all work together to make sure that those lists are drawn up. Also in the robot shed and the cow shed particularly, we wanted to replace Yorkshire boarding with space boarding just to improve the ventilation going through the shed. Another action to be done as soon as possible was to foot bath the milking cows every day with 2.5% formalin and replace the solution each time. And we've also set up a system in place which means that all of the health and safety aspects are being adhered to and correct PPE is being worn as well when handling the formalin in this concentrated solution. One of the other risk factors that we identified was in the dry cow shed. So whilst the milking cow shed is being scraped out regularly by the automatic scrapers, the dry cow shed was only being scraped out every other day. And so one of our actions, which was to be done as soon as possible, is to actually scrape that out daily. And also in terms of the foot bathing for the dry cows, that was to then be done 3 times per week. And this can be then tied into when scraping out is done as well. So those are the very short-term actions. So the last slide showed those actions that were to be implemented either immediately or as soon as possible. Here we have the short-term actions, so those that were to be implemented within the first 3 months following the action plan being drawn up. And you can see here that top of the list is to train up a member of the team in mobility scoring, and we wanted them to be Register of Mobility Scorer Standard. And then once they were trained up, to start doing fortnightly mobility scoring, to identify new cases of lameness early, and then we can ensure that they're treated effectively so that we get the maximum return on doing mobility scoring. The next action on the list was to foot bath the transition cows 3 times a week. Transition cows, along with the dry cows, weren't being done, and they really are a key component of digital dermatitis control through the herd. Also, in terms of digital dermatitis, the third action on this list here was to ensure that there was no mixing of groups on the top yard between the sucklers, dries and young stock. The young stock currently didn't have digital dermatitis, and there was a real risk here that the dries or the sucklers could actually spread it to them and create quite a few problems. So we wanted to make sure that we had clean and dirty areas on that top yard. In terms of mitigating some of the risk from the rough concrete around the robots, number 4 on this list was to install rubber matting around those robots just to prevent some of the forces on the feet of the cows are turning around that area. And again, when it came to formalin and formalin handling, the last action on this list was to actually install a closed siphon system for the formalin to make sure that there is no risk to staff using it. Whilst formalin is very, very effective in controlling DD, we need to make sure that it is handled correctly. And the action is finished with some of the medium to longer term actions. So I mentioned that we had fans to mitigate against some of the heat stress issues that we were seeing in the shed. However, these were actually over the passageways, and we'd prefer them to be situated over the cubicle beds to maximise their effect. And then one of the longer term plans, so for 3 to 9 months, was to replace the mattresses in the milking cow cubicles as well, because that was going to have perhaps the biggest impact on cow comfort and therefore sole ulcers and bruising going forward. And a final action, which is just a review at the 6 months, was to repair the feed barrier in the milking heifers so that it's raised up and we reduce the risk of those cows injuring their front feet as they're pushing to feed from that lower feed barrier. So that really summarises the action plan, and that really forms as the basis of reviews going forward. As I said right at the start of the presentation, reviewing is really, really crucial when it comes to making sure that we're actually seeing progress from the effort of changing some of these actions on farm. So going forward, we'll be doing 6 monthly reviews where we'll conduct another mobility score to assess how herd levels of lameness are changing. Also be conducting another DD score to see whether we've still got the same level of active lesions or whether we're bringing that under control. Be doing a further foot trimming record analysis as well, just to see how the number of lesions that we're seeing is changing over time. And then obviously we'll be sitting down with the team, reviewing and updating the action plan. In terms of setting targets, well, one of our key targets is to make sure that 100% of the cows are receiving a routine foot trim at dry off and 60 to 90 days in milk as well, to make sure that we've got that preventative aspect in place. Overall, we want to be reducing lameness to less than 10% of the herd, the lower the better. And to do this, we really need to be reducing the first lactation heifers to less than 5% lame at any given time. In terms of digital dermatitis, I want to see the herd treating, or the farm staff treating, less than 2 cases of digital dermatitis per month. And that indicates that we've got very, very good control on the farm if we are hitting that target. I'll finish by just summarising the key points from the project so far. Lameness is currently higher than the UK average on the farm, with sole ulcers and digital dermatitis the main cause of lameness. The action plan that we've put together focuses on improved cow comfort, reduced infection pressure, specifically for DD, and early detection and treatment of lameness. Ongoing monitoring is going to be crucial to assess the progress, and we will be sharing this with you at every review. And our key target is to be less than 10% of the herd lame at any given time by the end of the project. So I'll just finish by saying thank you very much for listening. And also thank you to the whole project team. There's a lot of us involved in this project. It's not just me, and everybody plays a crucial role in pushing this project forward and making sure that it's a success. We hope to bring you regular updates, and you'll be able to find these on the Farming Connect page for Graig Olway. The link is at the bottom of this slide. And we'll hope to be giving you an update in the next couple of months. So I'll speak to you then. Bye-bye.